and welcome to Dispel Magic, the podcast where we overthink how the magic of D&D might shape your campaign in surprising and unexpected ways. I'm Benjamin, game designer and writer. You can find me online at sterlingvermin.com.
And I'm Benjamin, game designer and writer. You can find me online at Twitter and on the internet. Sterling Vermin is me, Benjamin.
What are you doing?
The writer.
What? No, that's not...
Huh? What? No.
I'm Benjamin.
No, I'm Benjamin Huffman.
No.
The writer of the Pugilist class. And my name is also Dane, and I'm a Dungeon Master podcaster and a little stinker. And you can find me online at Dane in Danger.
Dane was mimicking me.
We're doing the Mimic today. Classic.
Yep, we're going to take a slight diversion from spells today to talk about this classic D&D monster, the Mimic.
I love when we do monsters, but we don't kill them. We don't kill every monster. No.
We don't kill every monster. We actually tend to find a place for monsters in society, and that's what we're doing today as well.
Well, mimics are monstrosity creatures with the shape changer subtype. They are medium, their challenge rating is 2, and they have the following notable traits. They have the shape changer trait where they can polymorph into an object or back to its true amorphous form. Its statistics are the same in each form, and any equipment it is wearing or carrying isn't transformed. It reverts to its true form if it dies. It also has the adhesive property. The mimic adheres to anything that touches it. A huge or smaller creature adhered to the mimic is also grappled by it. Escape DC 13. Ability checks made to escape this grapple have disadvantage. They have false appearance. When a mimic remains motionless, it is indistinguishable from an ordinary object. And finally, it can grapple. It's a grappler. The mimic, because it's got pseudopods, it wraps you up.
Yeah. That makes me want to go into a bit like, I've got a pseudopod. Can you wrap me up? Like from,
oh boy, let's not do that.
Okay, you can just cut that.
Hey, Greg. Hey there, Greg. I got a pseudopod. Can you wrap me up?
Pseudopod. Can you wrap me up?
Hey, come on.
That's not one of the celebrities I can polymorph into. The usual role of a mimic.
The traditional role.
Yes, we're talking about traditional values, traditional roles.
What a mimic is meant to be, what its purpose.
The usual. Yeah.
When the great Gygax in the sky.
What the gods intended when they created mimics were for them to be look like treasure chests, so that the heroes think, oh good, we're finally being rewarded for delving this dungeon, and then gotcha. And then they gotcha.
But watch out, pseudopod. You got stuck.
Yeah, you get stuck.
I love mimics. I love them.
I do too. Yeah, I do too. There's another really dumb monster called Wolf in Sheep's Clothing that I don't think is in 5e, but it's in earlier editions of the game. And contrary to its name, it's not a wolf in sheep's clothing. It's like a stump with a rabbit on it. And then you get close to it, and it's like a carnivorous like tree thing that's like grapples you with its roots and tries to...
You've thrown that at our party before. I
have, because it's so effing funny to picture like a rabbit that like no matter how close you get to it, the rabbit just doesn't move.
Yeah.
On this tree. Like it's the most conspicuous mimic thing in the world.
It's just a fluffy little bunny.
Like you would never just see a rabbit just sitting there not being chill as you walked close to it.
Not like a mimic that you would
No, not like
see.
a mimic. Right. Where like you would be suspicious if that treasure chest didn't just sit there as you approached it.
And mimics can be so many different things. I've heard of mimic walls, mimic doors.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But also to fight them is kind of annoying, right? Because they get stuck to you. If you're not careful, you can really screw up a party if you got too many mimics all stuck to people.
Yeah, well, you know, it's an ambush too. And I think a lot of D&D fights probably don't start as ambushes, and I think also the adventurers tend to like be cautious, be taking breaks often, and so if they go into a room, do a fight, and then there's treasure there, they're going to just try to get that treasure before they take their rest or whatever, their break.
Traditionally speaking, they get the treasure
At the traditional role, we're very big on that
in this episode.
in this episode where we focus on traditions.
Now, you have a quote from the monster manual here that is
Yes.
pretty interesting, if you permit me.
Yeah, go, please.
Mimics live and hunt alone, although they occasionally share their feeding grounds with other creatures. Although most mimics have only predatory intelligence, a rare few evolve greater cunning and the ability to carry on simple conversations in common or undercommon. Such mimics might allow safe passage through their domains or provide useful information in exchange for food. Now, this I've never heard of or encountered. A talking mimic.
Yeah. No, I mean, if you go back to older editions, talking mimics are, I think, sometimes listed as like separate creatures, like a more intelligent version of it.
I could
But
see
then they
that.
also get into like mimic colonies. So older editions have mimics that aren't so solitary as well. What this edition also doesn't get into is how mimics reproduce.
Right.
But if you kind of assume that anything that's not explicitly clarified, you can go back to older editions to find generally what to do. The older editions have mimics reproduce by splitting. So one mimic just becomes two. And there's a lot of like kind of leaps of faith here happening. One is that still would hold true in 5th edition, but then the other is that splitting kind of functions like it would in the real world, where a new mimic is genetically identical to the existing mimic.
It's a clone, yeah.
Yeah, which means they should be of similar levels of intelligence. And so once you have those, it says a rare few evolve greater cunning and the ability to carry on simple conversations. Once you have one like that, when it starts splitting, you get more and more like that. It's actually
intelligence,
yeah. If you think about it, those are also more likely to be successful. So it sort of feels like that. If evolution is a thing in D&D worlds, we can see that the future of mimics would probably be in this more intelligent language speaking variant.
And then they evolve society and realize their supposed utility. There's a whole track you could go down.
Even if you don't get to that, even if you just get to like modern day, or kind of take the description in the 5e manual as like a snapshot of where mimics are right now, all it would take is one person enterprising enough to be in contact with one of these intelligent mimics and realizing that there'd be a lot of like application for them outside of being just monsters,
right?
And figuring out how they reproduce to get them to like start splitting to create other intelligent mimics, to essentially have this. I wouldn't use the word domesticate because they're intelligent enough that it's more like you're integrating them into,
you're like developing them into a part of society. Yeah.
Right.
I do like, there's a bit of homebrew lore about mimics reproducing as gold coins. Mm-hmm. So baby mimics are gold coins, and then they go into a bank, and that's where they develop. Love that idea. And then I had in a campaign a tavern that my characters didn't actually enter, but it was a tamed mimic tavern. So everything in the tavern was a mimic, and the bartender had a trick for taming them. So I think we found that trick. I can do it for realsies.
Yeah. Now it doesn't have to just be, oh, I made this up. You can say, Benjamin told me I did this right.
Benjamin said it was okay, so that means it's okay. Everybody has to accept it.
That's my point. If mimics can reach this intelligence level without like an intentional education or a community, I think, I don't know a lot about this particular subject, but it seems to me that if mimics kind of on their own can become this intelligent enough to like speak a language and coordinate with other people. It makes sense to me that if they were partnered with one of those particularly ambitious people that wants to incorporate them into society, that they could probably pretty rapidly be brought up to speed on more complex topics and social skills.
They're the adventurer's dream companion. I mean, it's the Swiss Army knife of creatures. It can stick to anything it touches. It can turn into anything you need it to. It's got pseudopods, which we all know how useful those are. And so if you have a mimic on your side, you've got an advantage on any other adventuring party.
Huge advantage.
Huge, traditionally.
A huge traditional advantage. If we want to think through those advantages, let's jump back to the traits that you read for us earlier, Dane. And basically those traits boil down to a mimic can turn into objects and a mimic can adhere to anything it touches. So question 1 is, how is adhering to things useful?
Well, Benjamin, I'm glad you asked, because now is the time of the program known as Dane's History of Adhesives. Insert fanfare music here. That's right, friends. Dane did some research, and let me tell you, it will not disappoint. Benjamin, how old do you think adhesives are in our world? Because if you were going to say
20 years old,
because if you were going to say 4,000 years old, you'd be, wait, how does time work? Adhesives have been used since 4000 BCE.
Okay, so
it's a long time ago.
Years ago.
6,000 years ago. There you go. We've been using resins, putting things together, tree saps, that sort of thing. Typically, adhesives are used for bettering tools. So if you have adhesives that keep an arrowhead on an arrow, that arrowhead's going to stay there longer, especially integrated with twine and things like that. That's an advantage. You don't have to work so hard on making your weapons and tools. You can also use adhesives to laminate wood, which improves their durability. I looked up the adhesive education series on the Boss Tick website, which goes through a lot of these things, and adhesives, vital part of the Industrial Revolution, and how cellulose nitrate was commonly used in billiard balls. So if pool wasn't around in the D&D world, now it is.
Wow. This is good stuff.
This is the good stuff.
I hope you have a lot more.
No, that's about it. It's really good at making things more durable. And I guess my final point is adhesives could potentially lead to plastics, but that's more from the vulcanization of rubber than anything else. But if we could get mimics to turn into plastic, world breaking. Thank you.
So be sure to vote on Twitter about whether or not I ever let Dane do anything like that again.
My history corner's coming back, baby. I'm going to do research, I swear.
Well, the people will speak on that. In terms of the question of how adhering to things is useful, obviously, Dane would say you could make billiard balls.
Yeah.
So that's one
super
way
useful
in which that would be good. But nobles and law enforcement could place mimics that look like valuable objects in locations that they believe are likely to be targeted by thieves, since the mimic will stick to and then grapple any would-be thief, making it very difficult for that thief to get away and very easy for the noble or law enforcement to capture the thief.
Pseudopods.
Yeah, pseudopods. This is a bit odd, but there's an application for advertising, which is, I don't know if you've ever been to a Japan town or been to Japan itself, you might have seen, like, in some restaurant windows, they've got like plastic versions of the dishes that you can order.
Yeah, the examples of things that are perishable.
I can imagine that you could use a mimic to replicate a luxury good that's designed to be interacted with by the public, and then it literally sticks to you. So the idea is, as a merchant, you make it like once the person's interacting with whatever this mimic is replicated as something you're trying to sell, it's like literally hard for them to put down. You're just keeping them engaged with it longer.
They're more likely to buy it because they can't put it down. I love the feel of this thing. Oh, but I can't. Oh, I've gotten used to it in my hand.
I mean, yeah. I mean, there's an extent to which maybe this relies too much on our own, like my own Western socialization. But like, if I'm interacting with something I might buy, and then I'm having difficulty putting it down, and maybe the merchant tries to talk to me about it, I'm gonna just be like, yeah, just let me buy it, I guess. Then, like, I don't want to deal with the embarrassment of like having like gone this far in the process and not get it. So
Merchants would use awkward social interactions to hard sell people into buying things.
yeah, that's what I'm getting at.
That sucks.
It does. It does suck.
For years, mimics have always had a bad rap. Just a bunch of gross, toothy treasure chests looking for a free meal. But that ain't the case no more. Today's mimics are good-hearted, helpful folk who just want to lend a pseudopod. Here at Mike McMimic's Mimic Co-op and Clinic, you can hire a mimic for any task you might have. Whether it's your classic dungeon dive or just helping around the house. In a desert and lost your hat? Ask a mimic. Spatula break right before the big pancake breakfast? Ask a mimic. Need a crucial, irreplaceable piece of an ancient puzzle to reverse the ever-rising waters in a terrifying chamber of death? Ask a mimic. If you're not sure a mimic is right for you, try our week-long in-home trial, where you can hire a mimic as a blender, washing machine, or ceiling fan at no cost to you. Take it from me, Mike McMimic, not only the organization's founder, but also a member. Isn't that right, Mikes? Yeah, Mike. Sure thing, I'm a Mike too. Right on, Mike. I want to be Greg. Mike McMimic's Mimic Co-op and Clinic. Just ask a mimic. Just ask a mimic. Cut it out, Greg. I want to bring up a semantic point. The mimic adheres to anything that touches it. So if it touches something, can it choose to stick to it or not? And can it unstick?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it kind of has to be able to decide that, because otherwise, like once it sticks to the ground, it's just like always there.
It has full control of its stickiness.
And it has a movement speed. So it's supposed to be able to move around. So it must not like permanently stick to anything that touches it.
Right. So if the merchant in question has some way of telling its mimic to unstick.
Right. Yeah, there you go. Yeah, that goes back to like an anti-theft measure maybe, where you mix in mimic versions of your goods with other goods as a kind of way of warning people not to try to steal because they might grab a mimic.
Well, this kind of goes into your next point about mimics can change into any size, apparently.
Yeah, so there's no upper limit to the size of the object a mimic can turn into. And I don't know why I put this under the bullet point, how is adhering to things useful? Because I don't know how this is useful, but you could have a mimic turn into a giant boulder and go full on Katamari Damacy, just like rolling through a dungeon and just picking up every single thing and person inside the dungeon and rolling around with them.
In terms of a deterrent for thieves, if this mimic sticks to them and then turns into something giant like a boulder, then the thief can't move. The boulder is keeping them there.
Yeah. So then the second question is, how is turning into an object useful? And
can't think of a single thing.
No. That one I actually drew a complete blank on. So important to clarify or to clarify an unclear point is that I'm not totally sure if when a mimic takes an object form, if it just appears like the object or if it can actually function as that object. Like I'll give an example. So the trait says that it uses the mimic stat block still. But if the mimic turns into a hammer and wants to successfully disguise itself as a hammer, it's going to be pretty obvious when someone hits a nail with it and the hammer starts bleeding
Right.
instead of like pushing the nail
Instead of being
that
a
it's
hammer. Yeah.
not a hammer. So the question is, does it function as a hammer when it turns into that? And there's some amount of its utility that's based on that.
100%. I mean, if you want it to turn into a ladder and it can't support your weight because it is this creature and you smush it, then it's not going to make it's not a very good ladder.
Yeah, I almost feel like that gets into like, well, maybe sometimes it does, because like if the mimic can turn into any object no matter how large. Once it turns into a sufficiently large object, at the very least, like its weight should change and its ability to its surface tension might change, or its ability to carry things might change. I guess that's a function of it being a certain size, because that's how things work in D&D. Things that are bigger can carry more.
Sure. Well, and this brings up my question of mass being conserved. So if it can turn into giant things, it's generating more mass in itself, but it's also like that mass is going away very quickly. So you could sneak a mimic in your pocket and then it could become a sword later. Just, the barest of things. So there's that avenue you could go down, but like magic is real for sure. I get it, but messing with how heavy a thing is because it's so huge messes with the fabric of reality in this world. And I can't wrap my head around it. What the implications of being able to control the amount of mass that this creature can control. That's insane.
Yeah, there's probably some also way of creating. I didn't really think about this, but one of our very, very, very first episodes, we talked about the infinite hell loop, which I guess go listen to all of our episodes if you don't know what that means. In that episode, we also talked about a perpetual energy machine or a perpetual motion device. And I feel like probably if mimics can change into anything as an action, they could be used in a very similar way. Like,
interesting,
because you've got something growing so big, it's like pushing against its boundary. Like, I feel like you might be able to do it. Well, and actually, if it can turn into anything, then it should be also be able to turn into, like, once you have batteries,
which we have,
turn into a battery. Well, we're gonna get to that actually in a minute. So let me jump back and say, if a mimic in tool form can be used as a tool, then mimics are going to be everywhere, working kind of in tandem with artisans, because your blacksmith might be capable of wondrous things, but imagine if his hammer were sentient and could reconfigure itself in every, to
whatever tool you need
produce
it.
exactly the kind of hammer points or however you would say that. I don't think it would be fair to say that in this case that mimics would become like a cheaper alternative to tools. I think that's kind of on its face untrue, because mimics are people kind of in this context. But I do think you can imagine that mimics would create a kind of symbiotic relationship with artisans where they agree to serve as tools for the artisan in exchange for probably like a royalty split or whatever of sales, to serve as their tools. And what artist or artisan wouldn't want a sentient tool that can change based on their needs per project?
100%. And you can take machinery or whatever thing wherever you need it. You're no longer tethered to your workshop or where all of your things are, because your things are coming with you as smaller versions of those things. And then Now you're on the top of a mountain and you can get some really wild stuff happening in places that it's very difficult to get.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, absolutely. Yeah. Easy to just kind of pack up all your tools when your tools can turn into like a coin, and then you carry them all to wherever you're going to go and then do your work there.
Mimic Tamer,
Yeah,
new
yeah. I
class.
mean, yeah, it would
Mimic
let you do
Tamer.
like a lot of, it would let you do like a lot of kind of professions that normally rely on you staying in one place could be more itinerant professions, like a traveling blacksmith.
We're putting all those hedge mages out of business who are mending everything.
Right.
Get them
Yeah.
out of here. Move over for mimics. Mimic
Just so
revolution.
if they can't be used as objects, there's still probably ways in which mimics being able to replicate the appearance of objects matters. Like to go back to the idea of a blacksmith, you could have the blacksmith have the mimic turn into different kinds of armor as a way of showing what he can create. Or what do they call it? A fashion designer could have like the mimic tape different shapes of different kind of clothing as a way of modeling, I guess.
Testing out. Yeah.
Yeah, modeling things.
Or you have it become the thing on the person, and then you can measure the mimic and
Right.
make the
Yeah.
thing so much easier.
Yeah.
You'd get wild fashions that fit people perfectly.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about this before, but that especially combines well with fabricate,
Mm-hmm.
where as long as you've got the materials around, you have the mimic turn into the thing, and then you fabricate to look exactly like the mimic, and then you've got a permanent version of whatever that mimic was shaped like.
Now, you pose a very interesting question. Mimics can turn into objects, including spell components.
Right. If we want to drill down to one specific, the spell Raise Dead and a lot of other spells that bring people back from the dead require diamonds. So a question would be, if the mimic transforms into a diamond, can you use that diamond to cast Raise Dead, for example? And then, since that spell consumes the diamond, what does that do to the mimic? Does the mimic die if you use it in that way? Or is it reduced to 0 hit points? Does it just turn back into its mimic form and no longer looks like a diamond?
Reusable diamond. I really don't think it would work like this. I think that it looks like a diamond, but it is a mimic, right? So it looks like an object. It turns into that object for the intents and purposes of looking like that thing, but actually being that thing is a different story.
So I'm inclined to agree with you, but I do base this kind of concept on the idea that the polymorph spell really does transform you into a beast. You
Oh,
are a beast.
I see where
according
you're
to the rules.
going.
And this trait is called polymorph.
Well, it's called shape changer, but it says uses its action
uses the word,
to
okay,
polymorph.
Uses the word, yeah. And so that's where I don't know.
Yeah,
when you
the sticky
reuse
part,
that
yeah.
same word in a few different contexts, but it's not like a word that means a specific thing. It's a word that means something only in the context. That's where it gets pretty tricky. So I don't think like the game designers or something were imagining that mimics would turn into consumable stuff, but I also think that's a pretty fun avenue for exploration. Although
Heck yeah.
I don't think many mimics would consent to like
trying that out,
being destroyed to raise the dead or something.
If we've got mimics that have basic intelligence, can speak, even if you want to awaken a mimic at the very least, then we have mimic wizards. And mimic wizards would be curious. And I could completely see a mimic wizard saying, I want to try this out. Use me. Let's figure this out. Because wizards love experimenting on themselves. It's one of their major Achilles heels. So many hijinks from wizards doing crazy shit to themselves. And I think a wizard mimic would definitely do that. How many spell components can I turn into, and what happens when I cast the spell?
And there are plenty of spells that they could, or spell components they could turn into that aren't consumed when casting, to if they wanted to experiment with that
Totally.
without risking their lives too. So.
Instead of having a focus, they are the components that they need.
Moving on from whether or not mimics can be used as spell components, I do want to say one thing we haven't talked about is that when mimics can imitate objects, you know, if you think about something like mimicking a ship,
is a ship an object, right?
Is the ship, well, and not just is the ship an object, but does it function as a ship? I think it has to for the mimic to successfully imitate a ship. And then what's the difference if the ship functions as a ship? What's the difference between it, whether or not it's an object or a mimic? And then you've got a fun thing where if you've got a mimic who's tame, willing to work with you, and can turn into all these things, it's a ship when you're on water. It's a wagon when you're on land.
The most useful companion.
Yeah, and then it's a short step from there to think if the mimic can turn into any object, then mimics become more and more powerful the more advanced objects are in your world. If you've got cars, suddenly mimics can turn into cars. If you've got spaceships, suddenly mimics can be spaceships or computers.
If they take enough damage. So this is interesting because if they get larger, their hit points don't change, correct?
Correct, because they continue to use their mimic statistics.
So if you're using a mimic for a very specific purpose, you got to watch out for whether or not they're going to...
It would be very scary to go into space on a mimic spaceship and it's got like 30 hit points.
And it gets hit by one piece of space debris and suddenly you're shit out.
Ass out.
Your ass out. You're in the middle of the ocean and just
ass
like, well, Jerry the Mimic, we miss you so much, mostly because also we're going to die. Your jokes were great, Jerry the Mimic, but gall dang, now we have nothing. So I feel like you're kind of gambling there because the restraints of a mimic are not, the ship is a ship that can take so much damage. It is now susceptible.
Yeah, so that's a great point. I do think probably the most interesting use case around this is just the idea of a mimic as a computer, because then what happens to the software that it writes on its own self?
It's getting weird. Well, and part of me wants to say with that, like, no, a mimic can't be a computer. There's too many parts. But the classic example, the traditional example of a mimic turning into a chest of treasure. There are so many different parts to that. That's a complicated apparatus. It has gold in it, for God's sakes. So,
well, and hinges and a lock and
that's what I'm saying.
Parts, wood
different
parts,
materials. So what's the difference between a gold-filled chest and in your example, a computer or a crane? Can a mimic turn into a crane and aid in construction? A jackhammer, can it? You know, there's all these things.
So when we zoom out then and we look at the big picture of mimics and their role, I think we've gone into the fact that once there are intelligent mimics in the world, enterprising people will want to integrate them into society, and that shouldn't be too hard because you're going to find mimics more and more willing to do that, especially as they see more and more benefit to themselves. Like suddenly they don't have to hang out in dungeons; they can be wherever they want to be.
A little more stimulating.
Yeah. And they start taking on these roles as kind of like, I mean, essentially, they almost kind of become their own science fiction tool.
100%.
Because it's like an omni tool. It's like any object you could want. It's almost like what's in Star Trek, the
phaser?
No, they talk to the computer and
tricorder.
Like, Dane, I feel like you're messing with me because
fabricator.
Is that what they call it?
Yeah. That's what makes their food, like, anyway.
Earl Grey tea, hot, and then
that's right. Fabricator, yeah.
I mean, it is essentially that. Although it's not, it probably isn't producing food, but it is producing like a wagon when you need it, a sword when you need it, a hammer when you need it, paint when you need it, all that kind of thing.
Wait, hold on. That you just opened up an entirely new thing. Paint?
Paint brushes, I guess, is more. Although, actually, I guess paint is an object, and yeah,
That's exactly what I'm saying. What? It can turn. Can it turn into paint? What happens when you paint with a mimic? Benjamin, I need to know the answer.
I bet there's some avant-garde art that you could
God.
make with mimic paint.
Can mimics turn into a pot of stew, and then can you eat it?
No.
What does mimic stew taste like?
So much of this is gut, like what makes sense and what doesn't.
Benjamin,
I feel like mimics don't turn into stew.
If they can turn into paint and you can paint with a mimic, you can eat mimic stew.
Listener, if you're going down the rabbit hole that's actually a mimic,
at least a sheep in wolf's clothing.
Please. A sheep in wolf's clothing. A wolf in sheep's clothing.
What did I say?
You said a sheep in wolf's clothing, like a sheep that's trying to look like a wolf.
Keep saying what you were going to say.
Okay. Please let us know about it. You can tweet at us at Dispel Magic Pod or email us at dispelmagicpodcast@gmail.com.
It's true. You can do those things.
Why don't you do the thanks for listening this time, Dane?
Thanks for listening. And from me, Benjamin Huffman, we'll see you after your next long rest. We hope you've enjoyed this episode of Dispel Magic. If this has inspired any ideas for your game, or you have another take on today's topic, please let us know on Twitter at Dispel Magic Pod. You can find Benjamin at Sterling Vermin and Dane at Dane in Danger. Thank you to Slim Mittens for our cover art, produced by Benjamin Huffman, produced and edited by Dane Fox-McGraw. We'll see you in the next long rest. That's what you should have done. You should have mimicked me. Like that.
Gorsham, Dane.